11 years ago, on the eve of Lunar New Year, a group of Chinese scholars, lawyers, journalists, and activists stood trial for advocating a free, just, and compassionate society. They called themselves citizens, and they thought to promote a peaceful transition towards constitutionalism in China and to transform what they described as a servant society into a true civil society. Their demands included equal access to education, public disclosure of government officials' wealth, the right to hold citizen dinner gatherings, and the establishment of Citizen Lookout, a grassroots support system to provide for the basic needs of families of prisoners of conscience. And they were sentenced to prison for gathering a crowd to disrupt order in a public place. You're probably wondering, how do I know this? And why is nobody talking about this? That China had a chance to become a citizen-oriented society and respect human rights, but they chose not to. I learned about this incident through a website called China Unofficial Archives. It was founded by a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, author, teacher, and researcher who has been engaged with China for the past 35 years, writing on the country's search for faith and values, as well as efforts to control dissent and history. You're listening to The Divide. My name is Iris Xu.
Well, my name is Ian Johnson. I'm a longtime writer, correspondent about China and the Chinese world, I guess you could say. I'm currently living in Berlin, which is the place I've lived actually the longest in the world. I'm a fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies, and later in the autumn, we'll just go back to my regular job as a freelance writer. I was a journalist in China from 1994 to 2001, and then again from 2008 until 2020.
With his experience living in China for so long as a journalist and a longtime China researcher, he founded China Unofficial Archive that is, quote, dedicated to making accessible the key documents, films, blogs, and publications of a movement of Chinese people seeking to reclaim their country's history.
While I was in China, I began to work on a book that later was published almost 2 years ago now in 2023 called Sparks. And this was based on people that I call underground historians. It sounds kind of dramatic, maybe, but in Chinese, minjian, like folk or popular, unofficial, non-government historians, so people who are not working for the CCP and who are trying to dig out the uncomfortable parts of their country's history. Just like every country has uncomfortable chapters and dark corners, there are people in China also who are trying to look at things like the Great Famine and so on, like and other things like that, up until recently. So it's not just something last century, but also this century as well. While I was working on that book, and then later when I went to I left China and I began to write it, I was giving some public talks, and people asked me all the time, where can we find these books and these movies? Because we also have a bunch, roughly 200 movies or so. And I realized there's not one good, reliable place where you can find these. If you have the privilege to have access to a major research library, like if you have access to Harvard or to the Fairbanks Center at Harvard or some big university like that, then you can get a lot of this stuff. But even so, not even all of it. And it's quite spread out, and it's really only at major research libraries where you can get it. Or there's some things that are available online, digitally, at some commercial, kind of unreliable sites, I would say. Sometimes things come and go, and they're often formatted in weird ways. And I thought it would do justice or honor to these works if they were just presented in a relatively neutral, unbiased way, and that they could be searchable. So you can search for the works by tags, in other words, by topic, like say Cultural Revolution or era, maybe the Deng Xiaoping era or something like that, or by the format, so book, magazine, movie, blog, or by the creator. So if you know Ai Xiaoming has made a film or two, but you don't know everything that she's made, then you can just click on Ai Xiaoming and then it'll show you everything we have by Ai Xiaoming. So that was my idea to make it more accessible. I guess the target audience was mainly people I knew in China who were trying to do research but didn't have access to all this information. And of course, I know the site is blocked in China, but a lot of these people have VPNs and can access it. And I thought this way there'd be a kind of a neutral, reliable introduction. Here's why this book or movie is important. We're not advocating it. We're not endorsing it. The book might not be to everyone's liking or whatever, but we just think we're like a library in that we make these things available and then you can decide how you want to use them. We just think they're important, obviously. We think they're important enough to put in the archive. We're still building it out. There's still a lot of problems with it, holes in the archive, things we don't cover adequately, which we're working on now. It's an unending project, really.
What Ian and his team are doing is quietly documenting what has happened in a country where authorities violently seek monopoly on history telling. And on their website, there's a film that received most views. It is titled 家边沟 Elegy, Life and Death of the Rightists.
那这样啊，就是如果我妨碍你们，我在前面读诗，如果我妨碍你们，你们可以来一个人告诉我说不可以这样做，因为你们没有表态，我不知道。因为呢，就是我们是想祭奠那边的过去的，就是那些不应该死亡的、非正常死亡的那些人，那些我们的前辈。
What you just heard is a 5-part documentary by filmmaker and feminist scholar Ai Xiaoming. The film is about the persecution of inmates at the Jiabiangou labor camp in Jiuquan, Jiangsu province, where more than 2,000 people died. And this is also where Ian started his book with.
Well, I wanted to start with something that's set in the present. So it's set in her search for the truth about Jiabiangou, but is also linked to the past. So I didn't want it to be just about the past, because I think we all kind of know there was the Great Famine in the 1950s. There was the anti-rightist campaign in the 1950s, the Cultural Revolution, Tiananmen. We kind of know these things exist, but what interests me is the contemporary search now by people to uncover that and how they deal with it. So in her movie is a big, ambitious movie of over 4 hours, but it's not just about the past, it's also about how the people are trying to erect a stele, a 纪念碑 for this disaster that occurred at this labor camp where thousands of people starved to death and were worked to death. So that's, I think, the key reason there. I had also geographic reasons because the book is also based on a sort of geographic movement from the northwest of China through the heartland of China and then kind of ends moving out to other parts of the Sinophone world. And so there were a bunch of reasons. There were two main characters in the book. One is Ai Xiaoming and one is Jiang Xue. I don't know, it just seemed to work better with Ai Xiaoming starting it.
The Chinese documentary filmmaker and feminist scholar was born in 1953, and when she was 12, the Cultural Revolution happened, and Ai Xiaoming's family was caught up in the violence. Her grandfather was arrested and imprisoned, where he would later die at the age of 81. Ai's parents were both denounced for their relationship, beaten, and sentenced to labor camps. At the age of 13, she was forced to denounce her parents and live apart from them. She tried her best to fit into the system for survival. She joined the Communist Party, and years later, she moved to Beijing to work on her PhD at Beijing's Normal University. And in 1999, she spent a year at the University of the South in Tennessee, where she began to study documentary films and noted the political engagement of many local academics. Today, she has made more than 24 films, including documentaries about citizen activism, social problems, and corruption. And many of her films aim to uncover whitewashed historical events.
She's in Wuhan. She lives there. and still works. I can't remember exactly how old she was, about 70 years old and still very active, still does things, but she's not able to leave China. She has a ban on leaving the country until the year 2032, so a very precise date. But I think at that point she's going to be 80. So she must be 73 now. That would be about right. And I'm not sure, in 2032 they may extend it another 10 years. Who knows?
Like many human rights activists, including Nobel Peace Prize laureate Liu Xiaobo before his death, Ai Xiaoming faces travel restrictions, police harassment, and heavy surveillance from authorities. And the CCP views these historians as dissidents, someone who needs to be suppressed.
Yes, to some degree. I avoided the word dissident because I think it creates too much of a binary construct where you have dissidents as opponents of the government who are fighting. It has this idea of these like heroic, lonely people in the basement of a building or something like that, like an underground fighter. But the people I write about are a number of them have one foot inside the system and one foot outside the system. So, like they say in Chinese, 提着内, 提着外. And so the people who are, even Ai Xiaoming can be considered like that. She was a professor at a university. She got housing from the university. She has a pension from the university, but she's made these things that are not part of the system and put her in a somewhat oppositional mode. But that's not the whole story. So it's a continuum of people. Some people I would definitely say, yeah, they are dissidents. But then there are other people who are very much inside the system, but are just trying to change it from within if they can.
And so even when these historians don't have revolting ideologies inside their head, they're still treading a very thin line when it comes to what is allowed and what is not.
Yes, for sure. There are risks, for sure. And one of them is housing, for example. I mentioned Ai Xiaoming, that she did get housing from her university. And this is quite important in China because it's one of the few ways you have to accumulate some wealth is to get an apartment given to you or sold to you at a discount at a better price, and then you can buy it, and that will be your home. Obviously, it's not some sort of big real estate speculation venture, but it's an important way because otherwise property is very, very expensive in Chinese cities if you don't have that kind of support by your university. For example, another professor that I cite in the book, Guo Yuhua, she's at Tsinghua University. Because of her work and activism, she was never given an apartment, and she has to live way on the outskirts of town. Fortunately, her husband was in business. He bought a place, but even so, they could only afford a place way on the outskirts of town. It takes her an hour to commute into the university to teach. So the government has ways of putting pressure on people. Some are very direct, arrest somebody or put them under house arrest or something like that. But there are much more subtle ways of making your life difficult, and that's one of them.
Ian's book is different from his website. It is not about keeping these unofficial records or documentaries, but rather the stories of the people behind them.
Well, I guess the title of the book comes from a student magazine called Spark, Xinhuo, and that magazine was quite impressive to me because it was set up by young people in 1960 who were trying to inform the government about the famine. And then when they realized the government wasn't interested in what they had to say, they began to do a real critique of the system of one party rule. And many of the essays that were written then have quite a lot of relevance today. And I think that was really interesting to me. And when the magazine was rediscovered in the 1990s because some people did get access to their police file, and in the police file there were copies. There was the copies of the magazine, and they got photos of it. And then again, thanks to digital technology, in this case, the PDF, they were able to recreate the magazine and start emailing it to people. And many people in China at that time in the 90s and up to today, when they read it, it's sort of eye-opening. They talk about the students back then were talking about the problem of one party rule, lack of freedom of expression, the big one person, one man rule. and the corruption that is endemic in a system without checks and balances. This is why, the party is constantly having anti-corruption campaigns. It's like an endless series of anti-corruption campaigns, because it's always going to happen if you don't have any checks and balances. So all of those things were highlighted by those students then. And you think 1960, that's only 11 years after the PRC was founded, but already they'd identified the key problems of this kind of system. So I thought that was really important. And then, of course, those their magazine was then the subject of a great film by the independent filmmaker Hu Jie. And so I thought I would name my book in the plural Sparks, because there are more than just one or two people nowadays. I think there's a lot of people, so I made it a plural. But I think that really influenced me, that magazine.
And in today's China, it feels like there's growing pressure from authorities to those making unofficial or independent documentaries. I asked Ian whether he thinks this is a fair assessment, and if so, whether the pressure will make it harder for him to carry on with his work.
I think it is already more difficult. It's been getting progressively more and more difficult. It's somebody like Hu Jie, for example, he's very well known, of course, but he tries to make films. But when he goes out to interview people, the authorities have talked to them ahead of time and said, "Oh, don't give an interview to this person." And so he thinks, "Oh, I'll go interview these people," and then it turns out, "Oh, I can't talk to anybody." So it gets to be harder and harder to do that. But even for people who aren't as famous as Hu Jie, and I think he's pretty famous, he's subject of government attention. But even for people who are not, it's difficult. If you stand up in the street with a camera, somebody's going to come up to you in 5 minutes and say, "Where's your permit to film in the street?" And so that kind of thing, which in the past wasn't so rigorously enforced, is being enforced more and more. So it's harder and harder to do these kinds of things. But I don't think it's impossible. And there are people who are still making films and doing things, writing books. There's still magazines that are being made. One of the big magazines I wrote about, GE, has been, it's still been being published every 2 weeks. So I think it's possible, but it is more and more difficult.
Something Ian wrote in the preface of his book really stuck with me. He says, "The dominant way of understanding China is that nothing happens there except a string of dystopian horror, surveillance, cultural genocide, and mindless nationalism."
Well, I was being a bit provocative, but I think this is the way that we in the media, and I say this as a former member of the media, tend to write about China. We write about all countries by writing about the bad news, right? And certainly this is not a good news book. A good news book about China might be about high-speed rail or something like that. But I think it's maybe a bit counterintuitive or a little bit against the grain to say that, yeah, even though Xi Jinping has cracked down on a lot of things, he has ended independent film festivals, he's closed down a lot of NGOs, but there are still people in China today struggling to tell their country's story. And so it's a story of human agency. In other words, people not being just victims, but also trying to take fate in their own hands and doing things despite living in a dark time. That's why I started the book with a quote by Hannah Arendt, where she talks about people in dark times, that in a period of darkness, you're surprised by any light, that any light can exist at all is surprising. And it might seem funny to start a book on China with a quote by a Central European intellectual from the middle of the 20th century, but it was actually quoted by a Chinese person, the second other main character in the book, Jiang Xue, in an essay that she wrote on human rights lawyers in China. So actually, I didn't know the quote from Hannah Arendt until I read Jiang Xue's essay, and I thought, oh, this is perfect for also what I'm trying to say as well.
And that quote reads, "Even in the darkest of time, we have the right to expect some illumination, and that such illumination may well come less from theories and concepts than from the uncertain, flickering, and often weak light that some men and women, in their lives and their works, will kindle under almost all circumstances and shed over the time span that was given to them on earth. This conviction is the inarticulate background against which these profiles were drawn." eyes so used to darkness as ours will hardly be able to tell whether their light was the light of a candle or that of the blazing sun.